On 22 June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. More than 3 million German and Axis soldiers smashed across the Soviet border, convinced that the Red Army would collapse in weeks. At first, it looked like they were right. Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched into captivity. German panzers raced toward Leningrad, Moscow, and the rich oil fields of the south. So how did this story end, with Soviet troops in Berlin and the German army shattered? Today, we're going to break down how Soviet strategy, not just Russian winter or sheer numbers, systematically overwhelmed German forces on the Eastern Front. We'll look at how early failures forced the Red Army to learn fast, the rise of a unique doctrine called deep operations or deep battle, the way the Soviets used defense in depth, encirclements, and relentless counteroffensives, how deception, partisans, and industrial relocation tilted the strategic balance, and how huge operations like Stalingrad, Kursk, and Bagration finally broke the Wehrmacht's back. By the end of this video, you'll see why German commanders often admitted, sometimes with grudging respect, that they were outplanned, outproduced, and outmaneuvered by a Soviet system that became more dangerous every single year of the war. Let's begin with disaster.
When German forces crossed the Soviet border in June 1941, they achieved stunning successes. They encircled enormous Soviet formations at places like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Entire Soviet armies vanished from the map in a matter of days. Why did this happen? First, the Red Army was caught in the middle of transformation. In the 1930s, Soviet theorists had developed advanced ideas about deep operations, using multiple echelons of troops to break through enemy lines and push deep into the rear. But the purges of the officer corps had killed or imprisoned many of the officers who understood this doctrine, leaving the army with inexperienced leaders. Second, Soviet forces were poorly deployed. Many units were pushed forward near the frontier, vulnerable to surprise encirclement. Mobilization was incomplete. Communication and logistics were chaotic. Third, the Germans had years of combat experience. They had refined their style of fast, combined arms warfare, what the world would later call blitzkrieg in Poland, France, and the Balkans. The Soviets, by contrast, were learning in real time, under fire. But here's the crucial point. The Soviet Union did not break. Behind the chaos, the Soviet leadership began a brutal but effective process, learning, reorganizing, and adapting. The High Command, Stavka, was created to coordinate overall strategy. New fronts, large groupings of armies, were formed and reorganized. Commanders who proved competent in battle, like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Vasilevsky, and others, rose quickly through the ranks. And above all, Stalin and his generals made a decisive choice. They would trade land for time. Time to mobilize millions of new soldiers. Time to relocate factories. Time to turn raw recruits into hardened veterans. That trade would shape every major Soviet strategy for the rest of the war. To understand Soviet strategy, we have to look beyond the battlefield to industry and logistics. In 1941, As German forces advanced, the Soviet government launched one of the most dramatic evacuations in history. Over 1,000 large factories and millions of civilians were moved eastward, beyond the Urals, the Volga, and into Central Asia. Entire industrial plants were disassembled, loaded onto trains, shipped thousands of kilometers, and reassembled in the Soviet interior. Conditions were primitive. Workers lived in tents and wooden barracks, but the result was staggering. By 1943, Soviet industry was producing more tanks, more artillery, and more aircraft than Germany, despite having lost huge chunks of territory and population. This industrial strategy mattered enormously on the battlefield. It allowed the Soviets to replace lost equipment faster than the Germans. It meant Soviet operations could be planned with the expectation of huge artillery and tank concentrations. It supported the reformation of entire armies after catastrophic losses. On top of that, Lend-Lease aid from the United States and Britain played a critical supporting role. Lend-Lease supplied the USSR with hundreds of thousands of trucks, locomotives, rails, food, and raw materials, items that dramatically boosted Soviet mobility and logistics, even if Soviet domestic production still provided the majority of tanks and guns. Those American trucks, British and Canadian tanks, and endless trains of supplies meant Soviet offensives could move faster and farther than German planners often expected. So while German forces were burning precious fuel and struggling to repair their vehicles far from home, the Red Army was slowly turning into a relentless industrial war machine, capable of absorbing horrific losses and coming back with even larger formations. This is the first pillar of Soviet strategy. Build an engine strong enough to keep fighting, even after losing battles.
Let's talk about how the Soviets planned to fight, not just in theory, but in practice. Soviet military thought before the war produced a concept called deep operations or deep battle. The basic idea was this: don't just hit the enemy at the front line. Attack all the way through his defenses, tactical, operational, and strategic depths, with multiple layers of forces. Break the front, then flood the breach with mobile units that hit rear areas, HQs, rail lines, supply depots, and reserves. This was different from the German focus on a narrow Schwerpunkt, one concentrated point of attack. Soviet deep operations emphasized several blows, launched along a broad front, making it harder for the enemy to predict and react. In a typical Soviet operation, first echelon, rifle divisions and supporting tanks would smash into the front line using massive artillery barrages to tear open defenses. Second echelon, tank and mechanized corps would exploit the breakthrough, driving deep into the rear to encircle enemy forces and seize key roads and railways. Follow-up echelons. Additional armies would widen the breach, destroy isolated pockets, and push the front line further west. This doctrine took time to apply effectively. Early in the war, the Red Army lacked training, radios, vehicles, and experienced officers to pull off such sophisticated operations. But by 1943-44, the Soviets began conducting deep operations on an enormous scale, coordinating multiple fronts and armies. Crucially, Soviet strategy accepted heavy losses as the price of these operations. Instead of seeking elegant, low-casualty maneuvers, planners were willing to saturate an area with guns, tanks, and infantry, grinding down German formations until they could no longer hold. To the German soldier at the front, this felt like a wave that never stopped. Even if you repelled the first assault, another would come. If you stopped the tanks, artillery would pound you. If you pulled back, you might find Soviet tank corps already racing into your rear. Deep operations turned the Eastern Front into a battlefield where German tactical skill was not enough.
The Soviets were building a system designed to break the Wehrmacht at the operational and strategic level.
German doctrine relied on speed, momentum, and concentrated force. So the Soviets asked a simple question. What if we make the Germans attack again and again into prepared defenses and bleed them dry? From late 1942 onward, Soviet commanders increasingly used defense in depth. Multiple defensive belts, trenches, bunkers, and strongpoints, massive minefields and anti-tank obstacles, reserves positioned for immediate counterattacks. Nowhere is this clearer than at the Battle of Kursk in summer 1943. Expecting a German offensive against the Kursk salient, the Soviets prepared one of the most heavily fortified regions in history. Several main defensive belts, with additional fallback lines behind them. Hundreds of thousands of civilians digging thousands of kilometers of trenches. Nearly 1 million mines distributed along the front. The idea was simple but deadly. Let the Germans attack into prepared positions. Force their tanks to slow down, bunch up, and lose momentum. Use anti-tank guns, artillery, and dug-in tanks to destroy them. Once German spearheads are weakened and disorganized, launch counteroffensives with fresh Soviet reserves. At Kursk, this worked almost perfectly. German panzer divisions smashed forward, but instead of breaking through, they were absorbed by layers of defenses, losing irreplaceable tanks and veteran crews. After blunting the German attack, the Red Army launched its own offensives, Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Rumyantsev in the south, pushing the Germans back and seizing the initiative for good. From this point onward, Germans rarely had the strength for major offensives in the east. The strategic momentum had shifted.
If defense in depth showed how the Soviets could bleed German attacks, the Battle of Stalingrad showed how they could destroy an entire army using operational encirclement. By late 1942, German 6th Army was locked in brutal street fighting inside Stalingrad. Instead of bypassing the city, Hitler demanded it be taken house by house, factory by factory. German troops were ground down in close-quarters combat. But while the world focused on the city itself, Soviet planners were looking at something else: the flanks. North and south of Stalingrad, the front line was held not by elite German troops, but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, poorly equipped, thinly spread, and short on anti-tank weapons. Soviet intelligence identified this weakness. The Stavka prepared Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment. Two powerful Soviet fronts, each with tank and mechanized corps, would attack those weak flanks. Their goal? Break through, race behind German 6th Army, and meet near the town of Kalach-na-Donu, closing a gigantic pocket. On 19 November 1942, the attack began. Within days, Axis flanks collapsed. Soviet spearheads met and closed the ring. Around 250,000 Axis troops were trapped in Stalingrad and its surroundings. Operation Uranus is a textbook example of deep battle in practice. Soviet forces in the city pinned the German center. Carefully planned offensives hit the operational depth, the flanks, and rear. Once the pocket closed, the Germans were cut off from supplies, fuel, and reinforcement. Instead of immediately storming the pocket, the Soviets tightened the noose, using artillery and winter to weaken the encircled forces before finally crushing them in Operation Ring in early 1943. The result? The destruction of German 6th Army, a huge psychological blow to the Wehrmacht and Hitler's prestige, a permanent shift in the balance of power on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad proved that Soviet strategy could not only stop a German offensive, but turn it into a catastrophic defeat.
Another pillar of Soviet strategy was something less visible, but incredibly powerful: Maskirovka, military deception. Maskirovka included camouflage, fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, guns, and airfields, false rumors and controlled leaks, strict control of movement, and radio silence before major operations. At Kursk, dummy airfields and concealed deployments tricked the Germans into misjudging Soviet strength. German estimates significantly underestimated the number of Soviet tanks and reserves waiting behind the front. In Operation Bagration in 1944, Maskirovka went even further. The Soviets convinced German high command that the main summer offensive would come in the south, in Ukraine, not against Army Group Center in Belarus. They did this by conducting visible troop movements and attacks in the south, spreading disinformation, and concealing the massive buildup in Belarus with strict radio silence and camouflage. When Bagration finally began on 22 June 1944, the Germans were caught off guard. Army Goods Center was thinly manned, short on tanks, and lacked reserves. Soviet forces smashed through on a broad front, encircling and destroying large German formations. By the end of the operation, Army Group Center was effectively annihilated, with hundreds of thousands of casualties and dozens of divisions wiped out. It was Germany's greatest defeat of the war, even larger in scale than Stalingrad. Maskirovka turned Soviet strategy into a kind of grand illusion. German commanders often didn't know where the main Soviet blow would fall until it landed. Soviet strategy didn't stop at the front line. Behind German lines, another war was raging, a partisan war. Soviet partisan units blew up rail lines and bridges, attacked convoys and supply depots, sabotaged communications and fuel dumps, gathered intelligence for the Red Army. By 1943, more than 100,000 partisans were operating across occupied Soviet territory, especially in forests and marshlands. Their actions forced the Germans to devote tens of thousands of troops, police, and security units just to guarding supply routes and rear areas. During major operations, partisan activity was often coordinated with frontline offensives. For example, in the lead-up to Operation Bagration, partisans launched widespread attacks on rail networks in Belarus, making it even harder for German forces to move reserves or retreat in an orderly way. This meant that when Soviet deep operations pierced the front, German units behind the lines were already operating in a hostile, unstable environment. Their supply trains could be ambushed, railroads might be cut without warning, rear headquarters could be attacked at night. Partisan warfare was not the main reason for German defeat, but it was an important force multiplier. One more way Soviet strategy attacked the Wehrmacht as a system, not just as a line of trenches.
By 1944, the Red Army had become a very different force from the one that staggered under German blows in 1941. It now had a battle-hardened officer corps, massive battle-tested tank and artillery forces, efficient staff work capable of planning huge multi-front operations, industrial and logistic support that could sustain months-long offensives, And it used all of this in a series of strategic sledgehammer blows. Operation Bagration. As we've seen, Operation Bagration in summer 1944 targeted Army Group Center in Belarus. The Soviets deployed multiple fronts, essentially entire mini-theaters of war, in a coordinated assault. Key features of Bagration: broad front attacks that overwhelmed German defenses everywhere, not just in one sector, massive artillery preparation, including rocket artillery, extensive use of tank and mechanized corps to exploit breakthroughs, close coordination with partisan attacks in the rear. Within weeks, German defenses collapsed. Cities like Vitebsk, Mogilev, and Minsk were liberated. Dozens of German divisions were destroyed or shattered. Army Group Center essentially ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The march to the Vistula and the Oder. At the same time, other Soviet offensives in Ukraine and Poland pushed German forces westward. The Red Army reached the Vistula River, establishing bridgeheads in Poland. Soviet forces advanced through the Baltic states, isolating German armies in the Courland pocket. By early 1945, new offensives, like the Vistula-Oder operation, punched from Poland all the way to the Oder River, barely 70 kilometers from Berlin. These operations followed the same strategic pattern. Maskirovka, to conceal preparations and mislead the Germans, concentrated artillery and air power at selected sectors, breakthrough by infantry and supporting tanks, rapid exploitation by tank armies into the operational and strategic depths, encirclement or fragmentation of German formations, followed by destruction in pockets. German units already depleted and short on fuel simply could not match this level of operational tempo. The final act, Berlin. In April 1945, the Soviet forces launched the final assault on Berlin. Even here, Soviet strategy emphasized overwhelming force. Huge artillery concentrations, multiple fronts attacking from different directions, a willingness to accept heavy casualties to achieve rapid victory. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. The same Red Army that had been driven back to the gates of Moscow in 1941 now occupied Berlin, Vienna, and much of Eastern and Central Europe. The strategic contest on the Eastern Front was decided. So, when we ask, how did Soviet strategies overwhelm German forces, we're really asking how a state that almost collapsed in 1941 ended up smashing the most feared army in the world. The answer is a combination of factors, but all tied together by strategy. Let's recap the key pillars. Trading space for time. The Soviets absorbed catastrophic losses in 1941-42, but refused to surrender. They bought time to mobilize manpower, relocate industry, and reform their command structure. Industrial and logistic power. The evacuation and rebuilding of industry east of the Urals allowed the USSR to outproduce Germany in key areas like tanks and artillery. Lend-Lease aid provided crucial trucks, locomotives, and supplies that supercharged Soviet mobility and logistics. Deep operations doctrine. Soviet strategy aimed not just to win battles, but to break the entire enemy system, front, reserves, and rear. Encirclements like Stalingrad and vast offensives like Bagration show this doctrine in action. Defense in depth and attrition. At places like Kursk, the Soviets used layered defenses, minefields, and artillery to wear down German spearheads before counterattacking. Maskirovka and partisan warfare. Deception operations misled German command about Soviet intentions and strength. Partisans disrupted logistics, stretched German resources, and supported major offensives. Learning and adaptation. Perhaps most importantly, the Red Army learned. From the disasters of 1941 to the victories of 1943 to 45, Soviet officers and soldiers adapted tactics, improved coordination, and turned doctrine into reality. German forces remained tactically dangerous until the very end of the war. On the level of the individual tank crew, infantry platoon, or local counterattack, they often fought with skill and determination. But the war was no longer decided by small tactical actions. It was decided by strategy, industry, and operational art. And in that arena, the Soviet Union, with its deep battle doctrine, its vast industrial base, its deceptive operations, and its willingness to absorb losses to achieve decisive encirclements, proved not just able to resist, but to overwhelm the Wehrmacht. From the burned-out ruins of Stalingrad, to the fortified trenches of Kursk, to the broad, sweeping offensives of 1944 and the fall of Berlin. The story of the Eastern Front is the story of a state that transformed catastrophe into victory through ruthless, evolving strategy. This is how Soviet strategies overwhelmed German forces and reshaped the map of Europe for decades to come.